Professor Brenner is the Distinguished Professor of History and the Abinson Chair in Israel Studies. Abinson? Okay, we'll go with that. At American University. And he is also the professor of Jewish history. He's professor of Jewish history and culture at the Ludwig Maximilians University of Munich. Professor Brenner has his foot on many continents, and he has done some extremely thoughtful and interesting work on modern Jewish history, on the Jews of Europe and Israel in the 20th century, and especially on Israel and Israel studies itself. Michael Brenner has a gift of language and insight, and anyone who saw his Times of Israel blog post a year ago knows that he is capable of representing Theodore Herzl to the government of Israel. He is the author or editor of literally dozens of books, which was a pleasure. I had fun counting those, Michael. You've got just enough to call it dozens. And he has generously agreed to speak to us today in an unusual format. His topic is called End of Laughter, Back to Tears, which will be familiar to many of you who know anything about modern Jewish history. That is a reference that I'm sure he will address. Modern Jewish Historiography Revisited. This is the first of what we're hoping will be a series of what I've been calling of 5 points lectures. I like 5 points because it indicates more than a simple set of right angles, but in fact, a more complicated intersection of evidence, questions, and ideas. So I asked Professor Brenner to think about the 5 pieces of data, philosophical or theoretical statements or questions that have really shaped his scholarship. I told him he could use 5 loosely, but he said to me, well, you know, it's the first one of these, let's keep to 5. We don't know quite where this will go, but we're hoping that this will be a reflective, methodological, and insightful way for you, Michael, to think about your own work and to share it with us. Again, I thank you all for being here, and I do want to let you know that this talk is being recorded. And if you have questions, you're more than welcome to put them in the chat, and we will have time for questions at the end, but we won't take questions during the middle of the talk. Professor Brenner, welcome. Welcome to University of Maryland. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you so much, Max. It's a pleasure and an honor to be in this conversation. And as you indicated before, I do see it as a conversation. I will open with remarks, maybe half an hour, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for conversation. When Max first asked me if I would present in this series 5-point lectures, I said, sure, just send me an example of one of the previous lectures. And she said, no, you're the first one. So I really feel like a guinea pig here, and I'll do something we usually don't do so often, reflect on my own work, and I don't know how this is going. So let's see. I would like to share my screen, and hopefully that will work. Okay, ready. Seems to work. Yes. Okay. So I actually would like to start by looking. I tried to look closely at what I was given as the framework for this new series, which says, this occasional series invites scholars to reflect on 5 statements, questions, or quotations that have driven their research agenda or their outlook on teaching. We view this series as an opportunity for scholars to reflect on what they do and how they do it, and perhaps even why. So that's a lot. I don't know if I get to all of it, but I will try to connect 5 quotations, maybe there'll be 6, but I think 5 more or less, to my own writing and how they've influenced me, and hopefully it will be of some meaning for anyone else besides myself. Let me start with this gentleman to the right, who I know all of my colleagues immediately recognize. That's, of course, Salo Baron. Salo Baron known to us as the first person who was appointed professor of Jewish history at a Western university when he came to Columbia University, New York. And that's the building here, more or less in his time, when he came to Columbia in 1930. And I start with Baron because he influenced, I think, not only me, but most of my generation. When I came to Columbia, which looked, at least that building still looked the same when I got there in 1988, and Baron was still there, and I had the pleasure and honor to meet him a few times. When I came there, he and his idea that Jewish history is not just a history of suffering, as Heinrich Graetz is often quoted with, statement, Heinrich Graetz, the most important German Jewish historian of the 19th century. The shadow of Baron, even though he was still alive, but also, of course, after he passed away in 1989 at age 94, was very much around. And you all know Baron wrote so many books. He wrote his 18-volume Social and Religious History of the Jews, which ends, of course, in the 17th century. He wrote monographs on Jews in Eastern Europe, Jews in America. He was one of the first to write about this. He wrote hundreds of articles, literally. But he's really known mostly for this short article, which he published in a journal called the Menorah Journal in 1928, called Ghetto and Emancipation. And and here's my first quote, when he says, "Surely it is time to say farewell to the veil of tears theory of the pre-revolutionary history of suffering and adopt a point of view that more closely corresponds to the historical truth." And this doesn't count as a quote. That's just a kind of repeat of what he said later in his life in 1963. "All my life I have been struggling against the hitherto dominant lachrymose conception of Jewish history because I felt that an overemphasis on Jewish sufferings distorted the total picture of the Jewish historic evolution." So when I started out writing my dissertation, this idea of Jewish history is more than what popular histories make it. What many of us, especially, of course, after the Holocaust, see Jewish history as a long chain of suffering. That is so important. And it was important, certainly, for my own topic. I studied with a student of Salo Baron, Yosef Yerushalmi. It was important for my choice of dissertation topic at the time. And again, not just for mine. So many in my generation thought we have to show Jewish history is more than just suffering, more than a veil of tears. And by the way, let us not forget, and historians like David Engel and others have always pointed to that. When you read this small essay, Ghetto and Emancipation, carefully, he, of course, argues against a lachrymose version of pre-modern history. The ghetto is not as black as we often see. The ghetto for him here stands for pre-modern Jewish history. Whereas modern history, 19th, 20th century, if we look carefully at Baron, that's often overlooked. He's not so optimistic, but that's just in parentheses. What most people seem to remember is he's against a Jewish history full of tears. And then I thought, I looked back at my first books and my dissertation. The title says The Renaissance of Jewish Culture in Weimar Germany. And then another book I wrote at the time was called in the subtitle, Rebuilding Jewish Lives in Post-War Germany. So it's all about like rebuilding and Renaissance and full of life. And I guess somehow Baron's arguing against a lachrymose Jewish history found its manifestation in my choice of topics for my first studies, where I try to show that the Jews of Weimar, Germany, it's not all to be seen as a history of persecution or pre-shadowing what came in 1933. And the same after 45, there was actually a new chapter of German Jewish history, which it didn't end in 1945. So that, I think, was the setting where I started, and something that influenced many of us. I then turned to Jewish historiography, to the writing of Jewish history, or historiography. And I must say I was always, already as an MA student in Heidelberg and Jerusalem, I always loved the writings of the great East European Jewish historian Shimon Dubnov. Also because he didn't have the chance to study at a university. He was really autodidact. He taught himself. He wrote in a very easy to read way, easy to understand way. And of course, again, as Baron after him, and it's of course a very different generation. Dubnov was born in 1860 in Russia. He wrote also about many different topics. But there's one quote in his diary in 1916, where he says, "I build and rebuild the temple of historiography and pray in it in holy silence." And I always thought that's quite impressive. So here's this person who grew up, of course, born in 1860 in Eastern Europe. 90+% of Jews grew up in a very traditional religious Jewish home. He became secular later in his life, and his new temple is the temple of historiography. And, as a young student, you're so engaged in, that's going to be my life, right? I want to write about history. And I was very taken by this quote. And I also later connected it to a very famous quote in my own teacher's, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's book, Zachor, of 1982, where he has this often quoted phrase, "History becomes the faith of fallen Jews." And he refers to the first generation of scholars of Wissenschaft des Judentums, the first generation of scholars who, in a way, built the new discipline of Jewish studies. And what both these quotes, I think, have in common is that what we do, in a way, is maybe, our new temple, a new religion. I just listened in German to an interesting podcast last night about soccer being a religion in Germany. Yes, but we have a lot of religions, and of course you can be religious and a scholar of Jewish history. But for many people like Dubnov, that became the central element of their lives. So I brought this in because historiography began to fascinate me, especially again as a student in New York in the late 80s. And I remember, I think it was my second year, I had the opportunity and the honor to take 2 seminars on Jewish historiography at the same time, one at Columbia with Yerushalmi and one a few blocks further up with his marshor at the JTS. And it was this, the same title of the class, Modern Jewish Historiography, but they were quite different. They had their different heroes here, Zunz and Steinschneider, and with the Yerushalmi, Scholem, of course, and Scholem, and also Baron and others. And they had also different views. And, that's one of the things you learn as a grad student, that you have there is not one history. It's not as it really happened, as Ranke, German 19th century historian, famously said. That's not what we can record history as it really happened. We have our points of view, and this viewpoint comes very much into my mind in the next quote, which is by a not so much known historian, philosopher, theologian of the 18th century, Johann Martin Chladenius, who wrote in his Allgemeine Geschichtswissenschaft in 1752, there is a reason why we perceive something one way and not another. And this reason is the Sehepunkt, the viewpoint that we take on it. From the concept of the viewpoint, it follows that persons who see something from different viewpoints will necessarily have different ideas of it. Now, that's how Chladenius looked like, because I think it's nice to see, someone who is really from a different time with a quote that could well come from one of the postmodern historians, let's say in the 1970s, right? I wouldn't say Hayden White, but he went maybe a step further. But it took time. Certainly, it was not a typical view taken among 19th century or early 20th century historians. It took time that this view of Chladenius, that it depends on our viewpoint, how we write history, how we see things, will shape. And the book that came out of all of this was Prophets of the Past, which is a history of modern Jewish historiography, where I think, again, if I look at all these quotations together and of my own influence, it really it has very much to do with quotes like that. Um, and I tried in this book to show how the same events can be described so differently by different historians. In my case, in terms of Jewish history, of modern Jewish history. I mean, also not just modern Jewish history as events. I also look at ancient medieval, but modern Jewish historians, how they view the same events. And if you are shaped by, let's say, the ideology of emancipation, and our 19th century German historian like Isaac Marcus Jost, you will write more, and you can see it already in the title of his work, A History of Religion. If you're shaped by diaspora nationalism like Dubnov, you may not have Moses Mendelssohn as the big thinker as your hero, but a collective hero like the Kehillah, the Jewish community, as an expression of the Jewish collective in the diaspora. If you're a Zionist historian, you suddenly see, Jews always, the centrality of the land of Israel was always so central for them, even in diaspora, right? And if you sell a Baron and write in a more optimistic time in the 1920s in America, or even after that in America, you see history as maybe more optimistic, and so on and so on. So that's, I think, kind of a connection between my earlier quotes and what's coming now. And the next one, this is not a historian. This picture, which is my favorite picture of Theodor Herzl, he, of course, was the founder of Zionism, but not known as a historian. But I thought he actually had more insight into Jewish history than some historians did, as crazy as he was in so many ways. And there are many quotes I could choose. I happened to choose this one from Der Judenstaat in 1896, where he says, "We have honestly endeavored everywhere to merge ourselves in the social life of surrounding communities and to preserve only the faith of our fathers. It has not been permitted to us. In vain are we loyal patriots, our loyalty in some places running to extremes. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to increase the fame of our native land in science and art, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In our native lands where we have lived for centuries, we're still cried down as strangers. If we could only be left in peace, but I think we shall not be left in peace." And right he was. I mean, we didn't know that. In his contemporaries thought he was totally wrong. We're all going to be German or French or Austrian citizens of the Jewish faith, and there is a backlash of anti-Semitism, but it will go away. And Herzl didn't think that. And in that way, of course, many of his observations were quite prophetic, as he failed in others. When you read his novel, Old Newland, you can't help but have to smile about his visions of, harmonic living together between Jews and Arabs, and the Orthodox, they will just stay in their synagogues and the army will stay in their barracks. But in other ways, he was right. And he was actually pessimistic. If you read the last sentence, "But I think we shall not be left in peace." And I say he was pessimistic because he didn't really want a Jewish state. If he had to choose, if there was no anti-Semitism, he would have been happy to live as a German writing Austrian journalist and playwright. Once he writes in his diary, there's nothing that would make happier than being a Prussian aristocrat. But he couldn't. He knew he couldn't be. And as you all know, he had many other ideas how to solve this problem that he and other Jews were not allowed to integrate. That it was in vain, as he says. And first he thought, well, we could all I'll lead the young generation of Viennese Jews to St. Stephen's Cathedral, and they'll be converted to Catholicism. And of course, then he realized, well, this is a different kind of anti-Semitism. It's racial, it doesn't work. So I think it was a pessimistic view. And within this pessimism, he built in a vision for the future, namely, we can survive, we can make it in a Jewish state, which for him, of course, was a idealized, better, small Europe in the Middle East, an ideal Switzerland in the desert. As he says, with English boarding schools, French opera houses, and of course, Viennese coffee houses. And that was his vision. But I think this quote was important to me now that I think again about what was I writing, what was my research, because somehow I turned myself to the writing of the history of Zionism in these two books. And maybe I only realized this later from today's perspective, that it was also a turn following Herzl here into a more pessimistic view than I had started with. Because I think that in the quote I just read, as I said, Herzl was right. It wasn't just about Renaissance and rebuilding. It was a lot about the limits to this kind of rebuilding of Jewish lives in Europe. And that, in fact, led me to my more recent book. But before that, there's another quote, my last one. Yes, it was only man so far. I apologize, but here's Hannah Arendt, and I could have picked again many quotes from her. But one quote, which I think for what we see today going on, but also what again influences my own research, is something which she said, and actually at one point even ascribed to her mother and her growing up, where she says, if one is attacked as a Jew, one must defend oneself as a Jew, not as a German, not as a world citizen, not as an upholder of the rights of man. And she, as we know, she had a very complicated relationship to Zionism. She started out as a very dedicated Zionist. That relationship soured, became difficult after she experienced the early decades of the State of Israel, and even before. And much of it is reflected in her book on the Eichmann trial, for example. But I think she always remained a very self-conscious and self-confident Jewish woman. And that, and repeatedly quoted what I just read. And I think this is something which maybe unfortunately we are reminded of today as well. In a world where I am sorry to say, where we are attacked as Jews. And Jews in Israel, as Jews here. And I think her remark remains true. In the moment we are attacked as Jews, we should respond as Jews. Now, I wouldn't claim that it was that quote that made me write my most recent book, but it has a lot to do with it. So the most recent book was a book on Munich between 1918 and 1923. And when I started writing it, I wanted to write about the Jewish revolutionaries of the revolution in Munich in 1918-19, a fascinating chapter, which really many people, I think, avoided, or everyone who wrote about that revolution avoided to say what was so obvious, that all of the key players of that revolution were actually Jewish. Bavaria's first prime minister, Kurt Eisner, who became Bavaria's Ministerpräsident in November 7th, 1918. Then Munich had these two short-lived council or Soviet revolutions in Soviet council council republics or Soviet republics in 1919. Again, who were the leaders? Gustav Landauer, Ernst Toller, Erich Mühsam, and others, mainly Jewish writers, intellectuals, and the second one, Eugen Leviné, in the Second Council Republic, which was a communist one. But even on the other side, as I try to show in this book, even the assassin of Kurt Eisner, he was murdered only 3 months after being in office in February of 1919 by a Count Arco, a 20-year-old person whose father came of a long line of Bavarian, Austrian aristocrats, but his mother was a née Oppenheim from a assimilated, converted once Jewish family. And he was motivated also by the fact that he, because of his non-purely Aryan heritage, couldn't become part of one of those very right-wing extremist groups. So you have a lot of Jewish history on all sides in these years in 1819. Now, the only ones who always pointed to the fact that all the revolutionists were Jewish were, of course, the anti-Semites. Hitler himself writes in Mein Kampf, that's how his worldview really developed when he was in Munich. He came back to Munich in December of 1918, and he witnessed all of that. If that's true or not, we don't know. That's what he says in 1923. So I started out writing about these revolutionaries, and a very sudden, I mean, it didn't last very long, very violent end to most of them. But then I realized you can't really stop when the revolution is over in 1919, because after all, this is where Hitler lives in 1918-19. And that's where he founds the Nazi Party, or refounds the party and calls it in the name it was known afterwards. And that's where he, between 1920 and 23, he really sees a testing ground for what he wants to become and wants to launch, and a testing ground also for anti-Semitism. And Munich, without any doubt, becomes at least the German capital of anti-Semitism by 1923, when he tries his failed beer hall putsch in November of 1923. So what my book, and of course there's much been written on his rise and the violence in Munich, but what surprisingly hadn't been written was the Jews of Munich and all of what I just told about. Not surprisingly, the Jews were, of course, the greatest enemies of the Jewish community of Munich. They were the greatest enemies of the Jewish revolutionaries, besides the anti-Semites. I think no one else hated the Jewish revolutionaries more than the local Jews, because they knew what happened, like it was said about Trotsky in Russia. You know, he was Trotsky, of course, for the revolutionaries, but he always remained Bronstein for all the others. And it was the Jews who were seen in the Jewish revolutionaries, all of them. And the Jewish community of Munich knew that they would be punished if the revolution failed. And that's exactly what happened. But besides that, most of them also were quite middle class and not very left wing. So they paid the price. As they said in Russia, the Trotskys make the revolution and the Bronsteins pay the price. And afterwards, how did the Jews actually also respond to the rise of Hitler and the Nazi movement? And long before 1933, in fact, before his beer hall putsch in November of 1923, Thomas Mann, who also lived in Munich, the writer, wrote in an article which was actually published in an American journal, where he says, Munich is the city of Hitler. That was already in June of 1923. And how did Jews react to all that? How did they respond? Did they respond, as Hannah Arendt said, as Jews? Did they try to respond as Germans, as Bavarians, as citizens of the world. And you find all of that, of course, even among the revolutionaries themselves. And that makes them so interesting for me, that you find responses like Erich Mühsam, who was an anarchist, who even didn't grow up in any particularly Jewish way of life. But when he's attacked by by the leader of Munich's Orthodox Jewish community, Sigmund Frankl, Frankl published an open letter in the Munich newspaper saying, "We, the Jews of Munich, have nothing to do with these revolutionaries. Um, our hands are clean of their blood," and so on. Mühsam, who then is already in prison, doesn't, he could have said, like Rosa Luxemburg, "It has nothing to do with me," or Trotsky wouldn't, he would not respond to something like that. He responds from prison, and his letter was published in Die Weltbühne, a very important left-wing German journal. And he says, "Oh, this bourgeois Jew, Frankl, he thinks he represents real Judaism. No, we represent real Judaism. We represent the spirit of the prophets of the Old Testament." So that was interesting. And then you look at Eisner himself, the first prime minister of this new Bavarian state. And he was attacked. I mean, in the archives, I found files over files of anti-Semitic letters only in the 3 months he was in office, but also by Jews. There are letters by Bavarian Jews who tell him, "You should not be prime minister as a Jew in this Catholic state. That's not good for us." And he actually takes the time to respond, at least to one of them. I found an answer where he says, "I never denied being a Jew." And he says, "As long as there is anti-Semitism, I will remain steadfast in my," he was, of course, secular and all that. But he also happened to be had a close relationship to Hermann Cohen, the philosopher, when as a young man he lived in Marburg as a journalist. So here's a close relation. He had a close relation with Gustav Landauer. Gustav Landauer, the most Jewish of all of those Jewish revolutionaries, also an anarchist, very left-wing, but he was very positive towards Zionism. He loved the culture of East European Jews. He visited the Volksheim in Berlin, which was an experimental East European German Jewish institution for like for young East European Jews in Berlin. So Eisner says, "Yes, I don't deny my Jewishness, but I'm the prime minister of Bavaria. If that would be my greatest problem, that I have to take now care that Jews don't worry about anti-Semitism. Sorry, I can't do that." So all of them, or even, the communist leader of the Second Soviet Republic in Bavaria, Eugen Levine, born in Russia, he's buried at the Jewish cemetery in Munich. And who gave the eulogy? The rabbi, the liberal, not non-Orthodox, but the rabbi of the Jewish community, who was actually a monarchist in his heart. So all of those very interesting relationships you see here. But they respond in a way to attacks by anti-Semites and even by fellow Jews, also in a Jewish way. And I think that really was I would say my biggest surprise when I studied these revolutionaries, and later also the Jewish community in Munich between 1920 and 23. And little did I know, when I wrote this book, I wrote it in German, and it came first out in 2019 in German. The English one is 2022. But when it came out in German, I did not think so much of its relevance in the American context of our days. It ends with an insurrection. And when I did my English translation, I went over the proofs of the English translation, there was January 6th here in this country. And very different reality, a reality in which not just the threats to our democracy in America have increased, but also anti-Semitism is very different than it used to be. And then, of course, there came October, and that's after the book and after any other book I've written, but I'm wondering what will be the next, how will all of our next research projects be shaped by the time we live in, a time which, among other things, is shaped by a January 6th and, of course, by an October 7th. And I think all of the quotations I presented are shaped by the circumstances of the place and the time their authors lived in. If you think of Salah Baron in the 1920s in America, he had a more optimistic view of history than a Hannah Arendt writing where she came from, or today, or of course, Theodor Herzl from his own point of view, from his experience. And I'm not saying all of the contemporaries had the same experience, but it was his experience. And I wonder now, and that's why I thought I would choose that title. We all started out as historians fighting this common popular theory, which is so ingrained also in Jewish liturgy. Passover is coming. There's, every generation is against us. Purim, we just passed, right? They're always our enemies. Amalek is everywhere. That is the classic way of remembering Jewish history for many people. So we were shaped, I think my generation, and maybe even the generation before me, by a scholarly fight against it, against the lachrymose version of Jewish history. But where were we today? Today, we're back, I think, in a world where when we talk about it, we will receive a lot of resistance. And I think our task it always was, but it becomes more difficult, how we balance our writing of history so it wouldn't become, again, a lachrymose version of history, but where we maybe are more guarded towards a history that is too rosy and too optimistic. And there were, of course, historians who were already warning against going too much into this direction. I mentioned David Engel, or Todd Endelman, I think, is another one, and others who were a bit more careful in telling us, well, don't make this your temple of historiography. We're inscribed in your temple, and that's my words now, of course, is, Jewish history is, you go against the lachrymose, against the history of full of tears. The tears are still there in history, in Jewish history, and that's unfortunately what the present days show us. So I think my guinea pig tour has ended, and I'd be so happy to take your questions.
Michael, thank you so much. There's so much food for thought here. Would you, oh, perfect. I was going to say, if you'd like to field your own questions, that's totally fine with me. Does that work for you? Okay, so
Yes,
it looks
sure.
like Marcia Rosenblatt is your first interlocutor, and I will mute. Marcia?
Thank you so much. Michael, I really enjoyed your talk. And I say this as a fellow grand student of Baron's, but through a different line, because I wasn't a student of Yerushalmi's. I'm older than you, and I was a student, not just because I'm older, but I was at Columbia before Yerushalmi came. I was a student of both Ankhori and Ismar Shorsh. So I'd like to commend you for what you've said, but also perhaps challenge you a little bit, because of course Baron never meant that there wasn't anti-Semitism. Baron was no optimist. And in fact, if you read the social and religious history of the Jews, both the 1937 version and the 1950s and 60s and 70s version, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in there. What I think Baron was trying to do, and I'm sure you know this, but I think Baron was trying to do was to say it wasn't only anti-Semitism, or it was actually, he was going against the full phrase of Gretz, the Literatur Unleidensgeschichte, the studying only great rabbis or anti-Semitism, right? And he wanted to look at the fullness of Jewish life. He was, in fact, influenced by Dubnov. He was a Zionist. He was a person from the Habsburg monarchy. He was from Austrian Galicia, and he knew there was lots of anti-Semitism. There were anti-Semitic pogroms in Krakow, near where he grew up, in 1898. He was born, I think, in 1895, so he wouldn't have remembered them, but he certainly knew about them. So he was never that positive. He just wanted us to take a look at the positive things in Jewish life. It wasn't all anti-Semitism, and that's what he did, and that's why we all wrote our Jewish history from the point of view of the positive things in Jewish life that weren't just intellectual things, weren't just rabbis and so forth. So I suppose you could respond to that point.
I was just going to say, Marcia, that Michael, you're more than welcome to take one question and answer, or to take multiple questions. Feel free to be as creative as you'd like.
Well, I'd be happy to. I mean, thank you, Marcia. Yeah, I agree. I agree, and I hope I made it a little clear. It's more the perception of Baron than what he actually wrote, because what he really wants us to know is that pre-modern history was not just a chain of persecutions. And there's the famous passage where, if you rather want to be a Christian peasant or a Jew in the Middle Ages, well, maybe not a peasant, because your chance of not having a very long life was much, or a very long life at the time, for standards at the time, was not very great. And of course, you weren't a free person and all that. So he qualifies that. But again, as I try to say, especially for the period after emancipation, he's quite skeptical. And now this was written, of course, before the Holocaust, and as his family, of course, also became victims of the Holocaust, and still, I would say, there was some. I mean, I'm just thinking, and again, that was when he wrote the first version of his social and religious history, which was a 3-volume history. One volume was only footnotes, but the short one, and then Yitzhak Ber, the famous Jerusalem professor and Zionist historian, really attacked him a lot for giving not enough space to, and he says, and after all, Jewish history is a history of persecution. So there was still that tension there. But yes, I agree, and I think Baron It was also a short article in a popular journal. So it was very pointed, his argument.
Eli, I think you were next, and then
Oh,
Peter.
thank you so much. Sorry, I didn't want to barge in. Michael, very interesting, fascinating as always. So I'm not a scholar of Jewish history, so my two questions are kind of interrelated. One is perhaps it's not just only the present that informs our perception of the past, perhaps it's our perception or thoughts about the future. If you can talk about these different tenses, if we are optimistic, perhaps we look at things differently. And kind of related to that, and that has more to do with the profession of being a historian. Can we segregate the historian from the, I don't know, the ideological element from the political? So sorry, going to the kind of the metaphysical, the disciplinary element, but I think it depends on what kind of ideological, philosophical baggage you come with in a way that informs the way you perceive the past. Thank you so much once again, my friend.
Thank you, Eli. Yes, I mean, that's a big argument of mine in this book, The Prophets of the Past. Of course, I mean, it's almost trivial, but we have to say it. We're all shaped by our beliefs, by our ideologies, by our teachers, right? We're shaped. Sometimes we reject them, but we're still shaped by rejection. And in terms of Jewish historiography, my argument is yes, they go often hand in hand, especially if you go back to the late 19th and the early 20th century. I mean, take Dubnov, right? He was not only a historian, but also a politician. He founded the Jüdische Volkspartei, the Jewish People's Party, and he fought for autonomism, for diaspora nationalism in first the Russian Empire and then in the East European states thereafter. What was before? His ideology, was it shaped by his way of looking at history, or was his history writing shaped by his ideology? I don't know. I don't think we can also separate it neatly, but they both influenced each other. But he wasn't the only one. I mean, obviously, for Zionist historians, most of them had also a very clear goal in mind. Jews, first of all, the Jews are a nation. They agreed, Dubnov and the Zionists, but a nation with their own country where they need their own state. And therefore, when we look at history, that's what we're looking for. Somebody like Joost in the early 19th century was looking for, more evidence that Jews were a religion and so on. So yes, ideology and history writing very often go hand in hand. I mean, they do today. Look, Eli, we're both dealing with Israel, and it's obvious, right? I mean, when you have a certain political point of view, you can guess at least what the history book will look like. I mean, if I look at, I don't know, Rashid Khalidi and Anita Shapira, or their accounts of Palestine in the 1920s won't be the same. Now, is their politics shaped through their history? Is their history shaped through their politics, or because of they belong to different communities? I don't know, but they're shaped. And if we know a political view, we usually don't expect that their history is going into exact opposite direction. That's how, I guess, humans work. And I think, therefore, it's always important to say where we come from. I remember there was a statement in one of Benny Morris's book where he said, this, even for someone who comes from Mars, shouldn't know where I as a historian come from. And I think that doesn't work. We all have our viewpoints, as Mr. Cladenius already knew in the 18th century. And that also shapes the future, so the view of the future.
I think it's my turn. Right.
Should I just call? Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Okay. So hi, I'm Peter Wien. I'm a historian of the modern Middle East here at the University of Maryland. I'm wondering if you could comment on, I mean, with regard to your, journey through Jewish historiography, how the history of non-European Jews has influenced it and what role it has played in it, and also in terms of specifically Jews of Muslim majority societies, Jews in Arab lands, and especially with regard to the recent developments in their historiography over the past 20 years or so. Thank you.
Yeah, a great question. Probably not sufficiently, I admit. And here's another thing. We always, of course, also, not always, I wouldn't say that, but often we're influenced by our biographies as well. I wouldn't deny that for myself. I mean, one of the reasons I was interested in Weimar, Germany was that my mother grew up in Weimar, Germany, and I thought, that I think it played a role, and also the post-war German Jewish history. And my father came as a DP in 1945, so I was interested in DP story. So I don't, so somehow I would say the biography and of course the knowledge of languages had some influence on the topics I choose. But I tried, at least in a book I didn't mention here, which is a short history of the Jews, or others, to give hopefully sufficient space to a chapter, to these chapters of Jewish history, which traditionally were so often underrated and undervalued. And I think that, especially in a project I'm just thinking about now, that would play also a at least adequate role, I hope. So to make it short, I'd say I couldn't deal too much with the sources of much of that. I don't know Arabic. And Spanish, which, if you do it with Sephardic Ladino Jews, might be of interest. So I have my own restrictions here, but it's something which hopefully in the back of my mind always says, yes, that's there, and don't overlook it. Bernie, you're muted.
There I go. Michael, as always, I enjoyed it, and it was terrific and enlightening, and I also made notes for things I'm going to have to steal from you and things like that. But let me be argumentative, kidarki, as is my style. I want to make two points which are questions, but I always feel like I come off as being argumentative, but they're really questions. The first thing that you did, basically, you structured your presentation. These 5 points were around positive or negative understandings of the way Jewish history is going, and you began with Baron and Lachrymos, and you went on to Yerushalmi and fallen Jews and things like that. But it seems to me, so this is my first point, that in picking your people, because you set up this paradigm of positive or negative, is there something good going on or something bad? What are we, is Hannah Arendt responding as a Jew or thing, and what it means to be a Jew? Because you did that, you basically ignore the true meanings of the statements of the people that you're quoting. And I won't go into detail, but when Baron, Marcia already pointed out that Baron is very aware of anti-Semitism, and you pointed out the first volume of the history and so forth was, but Baron wrote that in 28. And he almost didn't get the job at Columbia because of that article. And the article, Miller tried to everything she could, because she saw that article as a nationalist article. She says it specifically. So in the context of the time, what he was saying, actually, I think he was arguing for Jewish minority rights. I think that was his assumption, and that's what he was trying to argue for. And if you really look at everything he did, I've written about it, but it doesn't matter. In other words, or if you look at Yerushalmi and you look at this Faith of Fallen Jews, and you remember that Zachor was written out of a series of shul lectures, of synagogue lectures, in which he is justifying a phenomenon that doesn't exist anymore or wasn't as common anymore, but used to be everywhere, that Jewish professors made a large part of their living going out to synagogues to tell them that they had something that was valuable for Jewish identity. And if you don't understand who he's talking to, and I heard the first version of Zachor as a set of lectures, and so as a class, the class you took years later, I heard him create that thing, and it was an attempt to create an identity for himself in the shadow of his colleague Isidore Tursky, who was a Hasidic Rebbe, and he had to say that he too was a Jew, and he was a rabbi, and he now had a way of talking. So, bottom line, the first point is that the terms that these people are using have very specific meanings in their time and place. And I think that you've missed that in your description of this sort of overall plus or minus. But let me just very briefly add a second point. And that is
a brief second point, Bernie.
Yeah, very brief. It seems to me that the hardest issue that we face in writing Jewish history today is that it's no longer a history of anti-Semitism. It's no longer a history of Jewish suffering. It is a history of Jewish power and Jewish wealth and Jewish use of that power, and how to understand or present Jewish identity, not in terms of victimhood, but in terms of aggressive nationalism and the danger of that. And I don't think you've done enough justice to that. I think that that's an important thing that needs to be addressed. And really, that could be the next book. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Bernie. I would have been disappointed if you wouldn't be argumentative. That makes it interesting, and it makes it you. So thank you. But you know, I don't really disagree. The problem is, of course, you're right. I did not give all of them the the credit they deserve in terms of showing the different contexts in each case, but then I would still be talking and you wouldn't have a chance to ask a question if I would go to every single context. And it was shortened, and to take all of those very different 5 or 6 people in half an hour, I think necessitated. But I don't disagree with you. I think you're absolutely right, and I hoped at least to have said it in a sentence or so, that Baron didn't necessarily say that. It was how he was often seen as, and how we all, I mean, you won't deny, if people would say, oh, give me one sentence, Baron said, it's, oh, against the Lacrimose version of Jewish history. And David Engel really was, I think, the first to write it down and say, no, it's not exactly like that. And Yerushalmi, by the way, taught it like that too. He said, look at the second part of his argument. Not just the ghetto, but the emancipation. So it's both there. But I think Baer and other critics of Baron understood where he was going overall. And that's, I think, what Marcia said before. Don't look only at the Lacrimose version, and don't look only at there is the other side. And it was provocative to a Zionist historian to say I'd rather be a Jew than a peasant in the Middle Ages. That's not what they thought. So put the Jewish suffering in perspective to the suffering of others. That's something which is provocative today. So put the sufferings of Israelis in perspective to the suffering of Palestinians. You could say, I mean, now I'm going very far, but in a way that was almost as provocative. only in response to the history. Yeah, I mean, the other, what was the other thing? I'm sorry, but maybe I'll leave. I mean, there's so many points.
Power.
We have to
Power. That was power.
the power, right? So honestly, that wasn't really my topic. I mean, I could have chosen that, and others like David Beale have written about it, but there's much more to be written about it, especially today. Sure, that could, and I mean, oh, I also looked at the Columbia University archives back when I wrote that book for the appointment of Baron. I mean, there were many reasons why Mrs. Miller wasn't so thrilled. First of all, he was a young man in his early 30s. And there were all these big professors. But one lucky thing that some of them didn't want the job, like Ismail Bogan and others. They didn't want to come to America. And that's the many reasons why I didn't get it. Anyway, thank you, Bernie. And I hope we can continue this discussion.
I just want to add one quick thing, which is that bad poets borrow, good poets steal. And part of the point of these lectures is for you to steal and own the points that you're talking about. So in that sense, I think it's important to claim them in your own way and then face the criticism. Paul, would you like to step in? And then I also want to encourage people who are not faculty members of the Meyerhoff or Gildenhord to have the opportunity to speak as well. You're all welcome partners in this conversation. Paul?
Thanks very much, Michael. I think you synthesize a lot of ideas there very well, or described them. I'd like to not surprisingly bring it back to Israeli history. Some points you touched on already several times. And my feeling, and I hope this isn't true, but that Israeli historiography has now become so politicized that it's almost impossible to study it from at least newer writings without sort of picking and choosing your political view. I can't personally think of any examples, and I'd be interested if you can, of such politicized history to the degree that some Israeli history is similar, very similar to Palestinian history. Some diverges so far that it's hard to even see it talking in the same realm. So I wonder what you think the future of Israeli history can be, especially as October 7th and the aftermath, however that develops, will really be a part and parcel of this as well. Speaking of lacrimose.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. You're right. I mean, as I said, I think historiography was always politicized, was always connected to the ideology, to politics. You know, you can't come from Mars, as Benny Morris said, and write history, because you come from somewhere, from a family, from a university where you had teachers. You have political views. You're a person with views when you write history. But I think that, you know, in my generation, the generations before and the generation after, we were all taught we should at least try to write history. We know we can't write it really totally objectively. We all know that. Although, you hear this demand often from politicians, just write as it was, write it objectively. We know we can't do that. We're not naive. But it seems to me indeed that we live in such a polarized world now that it is much more, and it's too early, I think, to even say and know what is history writing going to be after October 7th. But we know it's increasingly polarized. And let me give you an example, and I'm sure you're familiar with that. In the 1990s, in the more optimistic times of Israel, there were some scholars who came together, Israeli, Jews, and Palestinians, who wanted to write a high school book for, the history of Palestine, Israel. And then they found, well, we can't come up with one version. And what they did is to write a book where they agreed that on the left side of the whole book, and I may get it wrong now, but on one side of the book, there is the Palestinian version, and on the right side of the whole book, there is an Israeli version. And this book is called Side by Side, and I use it sometimes in my class, and students like that, actually. And I, of course, tell them, you don't think there is one Israeli version, one Palestinian version. That could be very deceptive too. But they couldn't agree to write one history, one narrative. But they agreed to have two narratives in one book cover. And I think that has become harder these days too. It's just become harder to build a dialogue even with colleagues who have a different narrative of this history. And that I see as the real danger today. No, not that we can't agree on a common narrative. That was always hard. But that we can't even agree that two narratives exist.
Thanks.
That is so powerful, Michael. I want to sit with that for a moment, but I have a question for you that's a little bit more about your process. The story that you tell is the story of a scholar, that you have an idea or thought and it leads you in a direction and it leads you to another idea and thought. And there's a kind of comfort with the process that I envy, because most of my scholarship happens and stops and starts and it's very painful. But so what can you say about the moments when you did see, or maybe you never did see, a kind of abruptitude in your own shift in interests? I confess that I thought of you as a history of the Jews, or a history of modern Jews. And so I was surprised when I started seeing your more recent work, although it's not that recent, on Israel. Was there a moment in your scholarly development when you said, this is a natural flow from these other things? Or have you had moments in your process where you were like, all right, I've got to stop because I must do this other thing? And again, I'm not putting you on the psychiatrist's couch exactly, but I'm curious to know whether you've had like a kind of herky-jerky moments where things have stopped and started, or whether it's all felt like a more natural flow.
Well, I tell you the truth is sometimes it's so profane. The short history of Zionism started because my publisher asked me if I would write that, and I think sometimes I have a problem saying no. And I thought, oh, it could be interesting, and that's a long time ago. And it was also a format where it was very short, and I was interested in that. So that brought me. I already had taught classes on, circumstances. We forget this sometimes. I mean, circumstances are so important in history too. I think, like I asked my father, who grew up in interwar Poland, and I said, so which youth movement did you belong to? And he said, oh, it depended. First, I was in Mizrahi because that's kind of where my family came from, in you know the more like national religious movement, and then I became more of a labor Zionist. But you know that's because the girls I was interested were in this group, or you know the friends were there. It wasn't because of my political ideology. And I played soccer in this group because my friends were there. And we put so much weight on ideology and on things. And I think, you know, that's probably true for so many. You go where your friends at, or you're interested in a boy or a girl when you're a teenager. And that's why you want to go there. And then you become maybe interested in it. And I um I thought um when I started out, yes, there were reasons, but then you stumble over. So there's a publisher who asks you, you want to write that? And said, okay, I have nothing else around, so I'll write that. So you're already in. Or when I was asked to teach about Zionism in Israel, it was because I filled a slot back then at Brandeis University, where Yehuda Reinhardt's, I think he just became provost then. So somebody had to be hired to teach German Jewish history. That's what he did, and Israel and Zionism. So I became more involved, but it was the circumstances. And then the same, I think, when I started in that position here, I thought, you know, my my I'm directing a Center for Israel Studies. I think my next book should be Israel. So it's sometimes circumstances which don't force you if you're not already a bit inclined to do it. But these are, I think, often more, it's a by chance sometimes, what really decides the way. And we all know that, right? Um, it's not always that. I mean, it depends. There are people who are determined for decades to write that book, and maybe that's true too. But for my case, I think there's certain. Or okay, and the latest book was also so that Munich book. I wanted to write my master's thesis on the Jewish revolutionaries in Munich. That's a long time ago, and I didn't. In the end, I wrote about something else. But I had some material already, and I thought, oh, now the 100 years anniversary is coming close, and nobody's written really on that Jewish aspect. So I went back to it. But again, something which was somewhere, I think you have to be passionate about a subject. So it's there, but there is often an exterior trigger to then write about it, an article or a book or whatever.
That's lovely. That's lovely to hear. And that, as opposed to a discussion of history, is in its own way quite optimistic. Are there folks who have been listening who might want to ask a question and haven't gotten the chance to yet? This is always that moment where you have to wait just one pause longer than you intended to.
But I'm okay. We're almost, I think.
Well, this has been a real treat, and I think that before we let you go, I want to not only thank you for taking on this this challenge, but also in the spirit of no good deed goes unpunished. What, if anything, did you get out of the experience of going back and picking these things? Was this did you find yourself thinking more reflectively, or, you know, more forward manner? Did it fit with the way you do history or the way you do historiography? How is this different from a typical talk?
Oh, it's very different. I mean, I usually don't talk about myself, and when you sent me this outline, how, you know, those quotes influence our own work, I realized I had to reflect on it, and I want to thank you for that, actually, because I think I mean, what really, I think, guided my selection of quotes was my own work, And that's something which maybe most of us don't do very often. And that's good. I don't want to give my talks about myself. But I think it's important sometimes, if we're at a certain point of our careers, to reflect why we're doing what we're doing, what has influenced us. And if I would do a similar talk in 5 or in 10 years, it might be very different things that come up. You also asked me not very long ago. It was like maybe 3 weeks ago or so.
Yeah,
So I didn't have a ton of time to think about it, to prepare it with a few other things I had to do in these last weeks. But I want to thank you, and I'm curious how other lecturers in this series will handle it. They might do it totally different, which I hope. But I also want to thank all of you who asked questions, and all of you who had the patience to stay on for so long.
That is a wonderful, wonderful note. It looks like Bernie might have to go. I want to let Marcia speak, but I do want to say that I hope that this will indeed be the first in a long series, and that you will all come back and enjoy them with us, because I do think these can take a lot of different flavors. Marcia, would you like to have the last word, or the second to the last word?
Very sweet of you. You could have said, no, you can't talk again. But I actually just want to say something about Barone. I'm glad, Michael, that you began with Barone, because people, he died a long time ago already, 30 odd years ago. And for those of us who sort of knew him, he was already retired. Even when I came to Columbia in 72, he retired in 60 something, 63 maybe. I mean, I'm not exactly sure when he retired, but he was a presence. He was there, and he was, he substitute taught, with some other professor in Jewish history had to go to a conference or whatever. He would not give a lecture. He didn't prepare even remotely. But the man had encyclopedic knowledge, and that was his forte. In fact, he was an encyclopedia of all of Jewish history. And people, he would say, ask me questions and I'll talk, and he did. And that was very exciting. That was very exciting for us graduate students to see that, in action. And so I was glad, Michael, that you gave me the opportunity to think back about my own experience of Barone and his wife, who was a very important part of his. They were a duo, and that was really great. So thank you for your talk and for beginning with Barone.
Thank you. And as I said, I was lucky to still have Madam Yerushalmi sent us students sometimes over to bring some copies. And one time, I remember, he had prepared, his wife was no longer alive. He had prepared some tea and cookies. And then I asked him, Professor Barone, what are you writing now? Is it the next volume of your history? He said, no, I'm writing my memoirs. And I said, where are you now? And he said, oh, I'm in 1908 when I was with my parents in Carlsbad or Marienbad, I think, and the English king was there, and he told this whole story. And then later, and Bernie had to go, but he knows that, and you probably too. I mean, his memoirs are there, and they're not ending in 1908. They were like 300 pages or more, and they're in the Stanford University archives, and nobody has really edited them, and they're really, I think, quite interesting. Anyway, we can go on forever, but thank you, Marcia, for that.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, and thanks to everyone for joining us. This was a real treat. Thank you very much. And we hope to see you all soon at our next event.